Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Jessica Devereaux in Baltimore. An unprecedented leak of millions of papers is exposing how the world's rich and famous hide their money offshore. The leak originates from the world's fourth biggest offshore law firm, Mossack Fonseca, which operates in Panama, giving this massive leak its name, the Panama Papers. Now joining us to give us the details of this leak is our guest, James Henry. He's a leading economist, attorney, and investigative journalist. Thanks so much for joining us, James.
Good to be here.
So, James, you've been tracking offshore tax havens for years. Can you just give us some of the biggest revelations to come out of this leak?
Well, the most important revelations, sort of sensational revelations, have to do with politically important people. For example, Putin in Russia, Macri, who's president of Argentina, the current prime minister of Iceland. We have quite a few people on the list who are engaged in various kinds of what I'd call kleptocracy, or have people around them who have engaged in hiding offshore assets through the facilities provided by this particular Panamanian law firm. And so one of the first things that to recognize here is the outrageous behavior on the part of government officials around the planet. People who are supposed to be cleaning this stuff up are actually in many cases, conniving with people that are engaged in it, hiding offshore wealth, manipulating money, not just to evade taxes, which is, these places are usually called tax havens, but there's a whole host of misbehavior that goes on, facilitated by the financial secrecy that you can enjoy by having an offshore company and then an offshore trust and having it managed by people that are in your name that maintain control over it and protect your private identity. So in this case, I think the most revelations, and there are a lot more revelations to come, have to do with these officials that are directly involved in this stuff.
You mentioned Iceland.
More generally,
can you just speak specifically about the Prime Minister of Iceland? What was going on there?
He had undeclared assets and investments that were in Iceland banks, and basically used offshore companies to hide those assets. Didn't declare them, and I understand he'll be resigning today. So that's just one small step forward, but and it's a good example. This Panamanian law firm did not exist in isolation. This is really the largest leak in history from this one $42 million revenue per year law firm. But there are literally hundreds of thousands of documents that are available. And we're just beginning to understand them. They've been out there for more than a year. But Panama is, and this law firm is a entity that I first came across back in the 1980s when I was investigating General Noriega. And this law firm was already established a reputation in Panama for being very aggressive, kind of the go-to place if you really wanted to get things done on the frontiers of good behavior. And it has acquired clients all over the world, kind of a network of other banks and other law firms and accounting firms that channel them clients. So it's really a global industry here. We shouldn't just focus on this one particular firm. In this case, they've handled more than 200,000 companies and thousands of clients, many of whom are politically exposed people. We're just beginning to understand how far-reaching this is. But take Putin's case, for example. He has close relationships with a number of wealthy people who are involved in this scandal, and it's hard to explain where their wealth actually comes from if it doesn't come from him. The president of Argentina, newly elected, Macri, just did a deal with the vulture funds that are based in New York but have their official operations in Cayman Islands. He's been exposed as having relationship with this law firm. The Brazilian scandal that we're now seeing with Petrobras, Fonseca was also involved in essentially setting up the ownership documents for the former President Lula in Brazil. And that's being investigated right now going to be investigated by the Brazilian Congress as they move to impeach the current president. So, this has wide-ranging implications. In Australia, they've turned up more than 800 international tax dodgers that they're going to be investigating directly as a result of this latest revelation. So, I think from my standpoint, the real issue is that we've known about all this for decades. Literally, there have been sensational scandals like this one, not as large, but going all the way back to the 1970s. We had the Castle Bank and Trust case. We had General Noriega in Panama using offshore banks to hide his money. We had the Marcos money. We've had the BCCI scandal. We've had on and on, the Russian mafia. Just recently, there was the Swiss Gate scandal involving leading offshore players in Europe. So the real issue here and the real scandal, I think, is the fact that governments have known about this and have done essentially nothing to close down the global haven industry.
Okay. James, I want us to sort of connect the dots for everyday folks, because some people might be watching this and just kind of saying, oh, these are sort of skeletons in the closets of the rich and the powerful. Right. But how does this affect me as an everyday person? So can you just do that for us? Connect the dots.
I think it's a threat to democracy. I mean, if you have a wealthy elite and political officials around the planet engaged in tax dodging and kleptocracy with impunity and using this offshore haven network to hide their behavior, it's really going to not only cause increased wealth inequality, it's going to shift the tax burden to the rest of us because we don't have a choice to use these fancy arrangements and to dodge taxes. And, it makes government kind of a shadow play in which, wealthy individuals don't have to be responsible. Wealthy politicians don't have to be responsible to the people who elected them. They can set up offshore companies and do deals in secret that no one can find out about. And this facilitates bribery, it facilitates corruption, it facilitates all kinds of financial chicanery, financial fraud. It's not just about tax dodging, but it should be of great concern to anyone who values democracy, because that's ultimately what we're talking about here. The ability of these people to have power and to have essentially excess representation without taxation and not with responsibility for their behavior.
Okay. James, I also want to go to the response from Mossack Fonseca. They essentially said that they've always kind of complied with international protocols and when they're incorporating a new company. So how much of what they're saying is true? Is this more of an issue with the protocols and the laws that we have on the books?
No, I think that this is, a standard response that anyone who sees this situation is going to make. But as we look at their behavior, it's pretty egregious in many instances. I think we'll have to be cautious about making specific allegations. But the big picture is that a lot of this behavior is unfortunately legal. Beneficial ownership registration, so that you know who owns companies and trusts in havens. And I would include Delaware, the list of havens, where you don't have to say who owns a company if you start a Delaware company. That is a major flaw in the international regulatory system. We ought to have public transparency about the ownership of these companies and trusts that are manipulating stock markets, that are facilitating tax dodging. That there's just no reason not to have full disclosure, and that is right now a legal activity. David Cameron, and the Prime Minister of the UK, promised to get rid of beneficial ownership secrecy in the UK, but he didn't extend that to Commonwealth entities like the BVI and Cayman Islands, and Panama doesn't have it. Even Delaware doesn't have it. So a simple test for the response of governments to this outrageous revelation is, can we just do that? Can we require companies to be registered when they're incorporated and show who the beneficial ownerships really belong to? We should also have public officials have to declare their offshore assets. I mean, this is outrageous that, you can essentially have a public official as prime minister of a major European country, with offshore wealth that he's not declared. That should be, absolutely required. But the big players here in this industry, the enablers, the banks, the law firms, the accounting firms, the corporate registries, they have had decade after decade of profiting from this kind of behavior. And, particular crooks, particular scandals come and go, but this global industry lives on, and that is the issue. We need to get a handle on this pervasive misbehavior by the global haven industry.
All right, James Henry, always a pleasure having you on the program. Thanks so much for being with us.
You're very welcome.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.